All right, so you ready for this? We're going to do a deep dive into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck.
Yeah. It's a good one.
This is not your typical self-help book, right?
Right.
It's a lot more like a brutally honest friend giving you some tough love.
Yeah, it is.
But, he uses some very colorful language, to get his point across.
Yeah.
But it really makes you confront what actually matters in life.
Yeah, I think his style is really what makes him stand out.
Yeah.
He's very blunt, and he's not afraid to be controversial. But I think that's what makes his message so powerful, because he cuts through all the BS and gets right to the heart of the matter.
Yeah. And he starts right away with the story about Charles Bukowski.
Yeah.
Like the gritty poet, the one who, everybody knows drank a lot and just lived this really hard life.
Right.
Not exactly the kind of guy you'd expect to be dispensing, like, life advice.
Right. The poet laureate of Skid Row.
Exactly.
And yet he ended up being quite successful, in terms of a literary career.
Right. So Manson uses this inscription on Bukowski's tombstone. It says, "Don't try," to make a point about authenticity.
Yeah, I think he's getting at the idea that Bukowski's success came from embracing himself, flaws and all. He wasn't trying to be something he wasn't. And I think that's, a really important message for all of us.
Yeah.
Because we're, bombarded with messages to be more, to do more, to have more. But what if the key to happiness is actually just accepting ourselves, as we are?
Yeah. And so "Don't try" isn't about giving up, right?
Oh.
It's more about, like, cutting through all that noise, all of the expectations.
Absolutely.
And figuring out who you are at the core.
Yeah. And I think that ties into Manson's idea of having limited fucks to give.
Right now.
Like, we only have so much energy,
Yeah.
so much time, so much attention, and we can't waste it on things that don't matter to us. So it's about figuring out what are your values? What do you really care about? And then focusing your energy on those things.
So, okay. So how do we figure out where to spend those precious fucks?
Yeah.
Manson, he talks about the feedback loop from hell.
Right.
Have you ever been stuck in that?
Yeah.
Where you're feeling bad about feeling bad.
Oh, absolutely. I think we all have at some point.
Right.
It's like this vicious cycle where you start to feel anxious, and then you get anxious about being anxious, and then you just, spiral down.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's partly because society tells us that we should always be happy, Like, negative emotions are bad, we should suppress them. But Manson argues that that's not true, right? It's okay to feel sad sometimes. It's okay to feel angry, to feel frustrated. Those are all normal human emotions. And in fact, it's healthier to acknowledge those feelings than to try to push them away.
Yeah. He has this analogy that I think is super helpful.
Yeah.
Where you're on an acid trip, right? And you're trying to get to this house, but the more you walk towards it, the further away it seems.
Right.
And it's like that with happiness.
I think that's a brilliant analogy, because it really highlights how our minds can work against us.
Right.
Like, the more we focus on chasing happiness, the more elusive it becomes.
Yeah.
Because we're not actually addressing the underlying issues, We're just trying to put a Band-Aid on a deeper wound. So I think sometimes we need to, like, sit with the discomfort, figure out what's causing it, and then address that instead of just endlessly, chasing some elusive feeling.
Okay. So how do we escape that feedback loop?
Right.
Manson introduces this character called Disappointment Panda.
Yeah.
And he's basically the embodiment of brutal honesty.
I love Disappointment Panda. He's so great. He's like that friend that, will tell you what you need to hear, even if it's not what you want to hear.
Right. And I think his main message is that, happiness isn't just some passive state. It's not something that just happens to you.
It's an action.
It's an action. Exactly.
He says happiness is a form of action. Right. So it's not about feeling good all the time. It's about doing things, that are meaningful to you, even if those things are difficult.
And then he takes it even a step further, right?
Yeah.
And says that the problems we have actually shape our happiness.
Right. And that's a really important point, because I think a lot of us we're trying to avoid problems.
Yeah.
Right? We think that if we can just get to this place where we have no problems, then we'll be happy. But, that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
There are always going to be problems in life. So it's not about, finding a problem-free life. It's about choosing the right problems.
Yeah.
Choosing the problems that are aligned with your values.
Yeah. He tells this story about a prince who has everything, right?
Yeah.
Money, power, everything you could ever want.
Right.
But he's miserable.
Yeah.
And he thinks, oh, enlightenment. I need to suffer to achieve enlightenment,
Yeah.
and that will make me happy.
Right.
So he gives it all up, goes and lives in, poverty and hardship. And guess what?
Yeah.
He's still miserable.
Right. And I think it's such a good illustration of how we often create our own suffering,
Yeah.
by chasing these arbitrary goals that aren't really meaningful to us. And that's where I think Manson's question, what pain are you willing to sustain, is so powerful, because it forces us to think about, what are we actually passionate about? What are the things that we're willing to, to struggle for, even when it's hard?
Right.
Yeah, because that's what defines us. It's not the easy pleasures in life. It's the things that we're willing to fight for, that we're willing to work hard for, and that, that we're willing to suffer for.
Because those struggles, that's what gives our life meaning.
Absolutely. And I think it's about, finding those things that you enjoy the struggle, that you find meaning in the process, even if it's difficult.
So it's like figuring out what battles you actually want to fight in life.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. Not the ones that other people are telling you that you should be fighting.
Right.
The ones that really resonate with you, Yeah.
Deep down.
Yeah, and he gives this example of his own, music fantasy. He thought, being a rock star would be so cool.
Yeah.
But then when he actually started making music, he's like, oh, I don't like this daily grind. It wasn't the right struggle for him.
Yeah, it's not just about, identifying the pain you're willing to endure. It's about finding the pain that actually, feels good,
Yeah.
or at least meaningful.
Meaningful.
That
yeah.
you find some sense of purpose in it.
Right. And that leads to this other point that he makes that I think is so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's how we measure success.
Right.
And he's like, if you're using the wrong metrics, you're setting yourself up for misery.
Absolutely.
And he compares these two musicians, like Dave Mustaine, who, had huge success with Megadeth.
Yeah.
But still, he felt like a failure because he was always comparing himself to Metallica.
Right.
And then there's Pete Best,
Right.
who got kicked out of the Beatles.
Right before they made it big.
Right.
You would think that would be the worst thing ever.
Totally devastating.
But he was actually happier after leaving the band.
Yeah, it's a great example of how those external markers of success, the money, the fame, the achievements, whatever it is,
Yeah.
they don't always align with personal fulfillment.
Right.
And Pete Best's values shifted after he left the Beatles.
Yeah.
And he found something that was more meaningful to him
Yeah.
than just being in a famous band.
Right.
So it really begs the question, what does success even mean?
What does it mean to you?
Yeah, to you.
What are your metrics for success?
Exactly.
That's such a good question for everyone listening to just sit with for a minute.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in comparing ourselves to others
Totally.
and using these external yardsticks
Yeah.
to measure our own worth.
Uh-huh.
But Manson's no, define it for yourself based on what actually matters to you. And then he brings up this other point that I think is really interesting too, which is that we often confuse responsibility with fault.
Right.
And he uses this example from his own life of a girlfriend who cheated on him.
Yeah.
And, initially he's blaming her, right, for his unhappiness.
Yeah.
But then he realizes wait a minute, I'm responsible for my own happiness.
Exactly. And I think that's a really tough pill to swallow for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because it's much easier to blame other people for our problems, right?
Way easier.
But ultimately, we're the ones who are in control of our own happiness.
That's both empowering and terrifying at the same time.
Absolutely. It's a total shift in perspective. But I think it's a necessary shift, because once you take ownership of your own happiness, then you're empowered to actually do something about it.
Right. And Manson, he doesn't shy away from the tough stuff, confronting your own mortality.
Yeah.
He's that's essential for living a meaningful life.
Yeah, he's got a whole chapter on that. And it's a really interesting perspective.
I'm a little scared to go there, but he makes such a compelling case for it.
He does.
He talks about how our brains crave certainty,
Right.
but that clinging to certainty is what prevents growth.
Yes.
And he gives this example of this experiment, where they have people trying to find patterns in these random events.
Yeah, right. Trying to make sense of the chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it highlights how much we as humans, we crave order.
I do.
You want to believe that there's some underlying pattern to everything, even when there isn't.
Yeah.
And so we invent stories, we create narratives, we cling to beliefs even if they're not true,
Yeah.
because it gives us this sense of control. Like we can understand the world,
Yeah.
we can predict what's going to happen next.
Right.
But the reality is that the world is chaotic
Yeah.
and unpredictable. And I think that's part of what makes it so beautiful.
Yeah. And he connects this to Ernest Becker's idea of immortality projects.
Yeah.
You know, these elaborate ways that we try to create meaning.
Yeah.
And leave a legacy.
Yeah, yeah.
Because we can't face the reality of death.
It's like we're trying to cheat death somehow.
Yeah. It's a bit heavy.
It is.
But it makes you think.
It does.
And then he kind of slips the script and talks about the power of rejection.
Yeah.
He's like saying no more often creates more freedom and actually leads to better relationships.
It sounds counterintuitive, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. It's about setting boundaries, you know, knowing what you're responsible for and what you're not. And I think Manson contrasts unhealthy love, which is about escaping problems, with healthy love, which is about facing problems together.
Yeah, and he gives some examples of like poor boundaries in relationships.
Yeah.
Like blaming your partner for your bad mood.
Oh, yeah.
Or trying to fix their problems.
Right, right.
That's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know, healthy relationships, they require clear communication, a willingness to both reject and be rejected, and deep respect for each other's individuality.
Absolutely.
And then he shares this story about his friend Josh, who died in a cliff diving accident.
Yeah.
It's such a gut-wrenching story.
It is.
But it illustrates how confronting your own mortality can actually make you less afraid.
Yeah.
It's like Josh's death forced Manson to face his own fears and realize, like, in the grand scheme of things, there's nothing to be afraid of.
Right.
It's a reminder that life is precious and unpredictable.
Absolutely.
And we never know how much time we have left.
So I might as well make the most of it.
Yes, spend it doing things that matter.
Yeah.
Pursuing our passions.
Yeah.
And connecting with people we love.
Exactly. And I think it all ties back to Manson's core message, you know, which is embrace your imperfections, choose your values carefully, and take responsibility for your own happiness.
Yeah.
Don't waste your precious fucks on things that don't align with who you truly are.
Yeah. It's almost like, you know, his friend dying gave him permission to, like, really live.
Right. To not be afraid.
Yeah. And it's a good reminder for all of us that, you know, we don't have forever.
Yeah.
So why waste time playing it safe?
And it connects back to, you know, the metrics of success that we were talking about earlier. You know, after Josh's death, Manson realized that, you know, those societal markers of success, the money, the fame, the achievements, they all just seem so trivial.
Yeah.
What really mattered was, you know, the impact he had on others, the memories he created, the love he shared.
Yeah, it really makes you rethink, like, your own priorities.
For sure.
You know? What would you do differently if you knew you only had a limited amount of time left?
That's a great question.
What would you finally, like, stop giving a fuck about?
What would you let go of?
Yeah.
Yeah, Manson talks about how, you know, our culture, we tend to avoid the topic of death.
Right.
But it's that very avoidance that leads to anxiety and a sense of meaninglessness.
Yeah.
So he suggests that by confronting our mortality, we can actually live more fully in the present moment.
Easier said than done.
It is.
But he does offer some, like, practical suggestions.
Yeah.
Talks about, like, the importance of choosing values that are aligned with your true self.
Right. Not the values that society is dictating to you.
Right.
You know, he gives this example of a man who's obsessed with his height. You know, he believes that being taller is going to, you know, make him more successful with women.
Oh, yeah.
But that's a recipe for misery.
Of course.
Because it's a value that he can't control.
Yeah.
Right. So Manson encourages us to choose values that are, you know, based on our own efforts and our choices.
Yeah.
Things like honesty, kindness, creativity. You know, values that empower us.
Right. That make you feel good about yourself.
Exactly. Rather than make us feel inadequate.
So if your happiness hinges on something that you can't control, you're always going to be at the mercy of, you know, outside forces.
Yeah.
But if you focus on things you can control, like your actions and attitudes, then you have a much better chance of finding some, like, lasting fulfillment.
Absolutely. And Manson also, you know, he points out that values can evolve.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's not like you just, you know, choose your values one time and that's it.
Right.
He shares how his own values shifted after a a painful breakup.
Okay.
He realized that he'd been prioritizing the wrong things in that relationship,
Uh-huh.
and he needed to focus on his own self-worth.
Okay.
So it's a good reminder that even difficult experiences can lead to, growth
Yeah.
and a clearer understanding of what really matters to us.
So it's not just about choosing the right values. It's about being open to reevaluating them as we learn and grow.
Absolutely. It's an ongoing process.
Right.
And Manson also, he dives into this interesting idea.
Yeah.
He calls it the failure-success paradox.
Okay.
And it's, we often focus on achieving these, specific goals.
Yeah.
But he argues that that can actually limit our happiness.
It's like you're always striving for the next thing, and then once you get there, you're already looking ahead to the next thing.
Yeah. Right, exactly. You never really savor the moment.
Right.
You never really appreciate what you've accomplished.
Okay.
He uses the example of Picasso. Picasso continued to create art even after he achieved global fame.
Yeah.
So, his underlying value was honest expression.
Yeah.
And that allowed him to find joy in the process, regardless of, external validation.
Right.
So Manson argues that it's this focus on the process rather than the outcome that leads to lasting happiness.
So it's like finding joy in the journey,
Exactly.
not just the destination.
It's a subtle shift in perspective, but it's a really powerful one.
Yeah.
And, Manson doesn't shy away from the darker side of life either.
Right.
He acknowledges that pain is an inevitable part of the human experience.
Uh-huh.
But he also argues that it's often through our struggles that we learn and grow the most.
Right. Like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Exactly. He even cites research from a Polish psychologist who studied World War II survivors and found that many of them experienced significant personal growth as a result of their trauma.
Wow.
So, it's not to say that we should seek out pain or suffering,
Right.
but rather that we should embrace it as an opportunity for growth and transformation,
So pain can be a powerful teacher.
if we're willing to learn from it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
What are some of the key takeaways?
Well, I think, Manson's book is full of wisdom.
Yeah.
But if I had to distill it down to just a few key points, I would say, choose your values carefully. Take responsibility for your own happiness. Embrace failure as a learning opportunity. And confront your own mortality. Give your fucks to the things that truly matter.
Yeah.
And let go of the rest.
And remember, you don't have to have it all figured out.
Right.
Life is messy, and that's okay.
That's part of the beauty of it.
Yeah, embrace the imperfections.
Yeah.
The challenges, the uncertainties. That's where the real growth happens.
Absolutely. Well said.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, this was fun.
We hope it's giving you some, some food for thought,
Yeah.
maybe even a little bit of courage to go out there and live a more authentic and fulfilling life.
And remember, as Manson says, don't try.
Yeah.
Just be yourself.